Well, I am so grateful to have you on the show. And sure most people know you by now, but could you please introduce yourself and tell us where we can find you and what kind of content you make?
Hi, my name is Shivam Bhatt, and I'm a member of the Commander Advisory Group, and I'm also a podcaster. I host 3 podcasts. One of them is called Casual Magic, which is an interview podcast that comes out every Tuesday. One of them is called Shivam and Wheeler Love Magic, where me and my friend Wheeler go through every single set in the history of Magic, one set at a time, talking exhaustively about all the cards in there. And then one is a Dragonlance podcast that comes out monthly, where I sit and talk with my friend about a couple of chapters out of the first Dragonlance novels at a time, as we're doing a chapter by chapter of the first trilogy. And you can also find me basically on Twitter 25 hours a day at Gears. You might think of me as the unofficial press secretary for the Rules Committee of Commander. I'm out there communicating with people, trying to make sure folks are having a good time and trying to make sure everybody understands what's going on.
Wonderful. That's actually my first time, I think, hearing about your third podcast. So I'll definitely check it out. And for anybody who's listening, you can check out the show notes, or if you're on YouTube, you can check the description. All those notes will be down there. Probably direct links and also your link tree, since everybody has one of those these days.
It's easier.
Yeah, it really is. I can't tell you how much link chasing I had to do just to get everybody set up. So, as you might imagine, being that Shivam here is a big part of communicating with the Magic player base and kind of keeping that conversation alive, we're here to talk about having conversations, specifically the Rule Zero conversation, but also beyond that, and how we need to be talking to each other, not just in the sense of pre-game conversations, but also just in general in the open space and being respectful and having an open dialogue and not just being part of the game. I know that's probably like a word soup there, but it's a big part of what we do here is magic philosophy here on the Hive Mind podcast. So we're happy to have you here because your perspective is always valuable. And if you want
Mm,
to briefly, let's talk about what Rule Zero is or what it might mean
ooh.
specifically to us. And I know that's kind of a big topic, but just in a brief way, what can we talk about that if someone new to the game came in, what would we tell
Okay.
them?
All right. So here's basically the nuts and bolts. Rule Zero is called Rule Zero because it's not one of the official rules of Commander. It's not like one of the deck construction rules. It's not one of the play rules. It's not like a banned cards rules. What it is, it's an extension of an idea that exists in tabletop role playing, where it's also called Rule Zero, which is basically the pre-game conversation. What it is it's a formalized informal discussion, which is to say, in summary, in English, talk to people. The whole point of Rule Zero is to make sure that when you sit down to a table and you start to play the game, you know what game you're getting, you know what you're expecting, you know, generally speaking, what the vibe at the table is going to be. And you can choose before you even start whether this experience is a thing that you want to have or not. The whole point of Rule Zero is to stop gross mismatches of deck types or play styles or anything like that. Toby Elliott, one of the founding members of the Rules Committee, likes to say, not playing Commander is better than playing bad Commander. And similarly, when you're in a tabletop situation, not playing an RPG with a bunch of people who are like, if you're here as a dramatist who wants to get deeply in character and talk to every NPC and have a lot of story time, and you're sitting at a table full of people whose idea of a good time is to go stat heavy and go grind into like goblin caves, kill the people, take the loot, level up, one of you is not going to have a good time. And you guys are going to have a miserable time. You're going to blame each other. You're going to have a lot of just miscommunication and like just a lot of unhappiness. And 4 to 6 hours of your life is going to be just wasted. Rule Zero says that when you sit down, you're like, hey guys, I'm really into this sort of thing. What are y'all doing? And they're like, hey, we're not into that kind of game. We're playing this kind of game. And you're like, okay, great. I can bring that deck, or I can choose to find a different table to play at. In Commander, we noticed one of the biggest problems when the Commander Advisory Group was started 4 years ago. One of the biggest issues we ran into was the fact that there were people, the idea of pub stomping. Pub stomping, of course, is when like a person comes and sits down to a table with like a CDH tier deck or like a competitive deck or some kind of like turn 2 infinite combo or whatever it is, and just wipes the table of people who are playing like their Thalid deck or just like good stuff allies or whatever crap they've got going on. for a long time, Commander, because it was a small community, because it was very hostile to competitive and high power play, basically had no concept, like no mechanism to stop that from happening. And it wasn't until we basically acknowledged that CDH exists and is a good thing for the format, and then also started telling people, hey, if you sit down to a game and say, guys, I brought my competitive deck. What are we playing here today? And everybody's like, we're playing more of a relaxed, laid back game. They're like, okay, great. I'll go find that competitive table instead. And by doing so, we have discovered that a huge, huge percentage of pub stomping has just stopped, has faded, because now people have the right seats to go to. And so that, in a nutshell, is what Rule Zero is. Rule Zero is making sure that you know what table you're sitting at and that you're at the table that is best suited for the experience you want.
Well said. Well said. I really love how in depth you went on that there. And I really like that it's just a very simply said that it's just making sure everyone's on the same page, but you really can go beyond just the confines of the game and other social experiences. I really like the idea that Rule Zero also covers things that aren't in the rules. So you can play however you want to play. You can play Magic with complete nonsense rules, and that's also okay. Rule Zero covers such a wide variety of situations, and not just necessarily the simple ones that we go through day to day or once a week or at your LGS. As long as you're communicating with people and making sure you're on the same page, you can do whatever you want in any game you want. It's not just a Magic specific thing.
Everybody's like, oh, if Rule Zero exists, then why do you need a rules committee at all? What the whole point is that the rules committee of Commander gives you a baseline language to speak in with other Commander players. You and I both know that we're going to sit down, we're going to have a 100 card deck, we're going to have 1 to 2 pieces of cardboard in our command zone, we're going to have color identity, and we're going to follow the same basic, at least, notion of game we're playing. It's not like I sit there and bring a pauper deck to a vintage table, because even though it's legal in vintage, I would get shellacked, right? This is more like, hey, look, we all know that we're playing the same rough game. So what Rule Zero does is helps you refine that so that we have this better idea of, okay, we know we're both playing Commander. What does that mean for you and me? And how do I make sure that you and I are going to have a good time? Like, a lot of people have tried to do things like put numbers on this, like, oh yeah, this deck's a 4, this deck's a 7. That's okay, but really it's a useless stat, because the fact that there's no grounded comparison point. There's no like, this is a 1, this is a 5, this is a 10 to like anchor to. It's a very nebulous idea of power, because how do you decide the power level of 300,000 cards or whatever exists? You don't. And so Rule Zero kind of gives you, like, if you look at CDH's notion is, we're going to sit here, play the most powerful decks we can. We're going to play infinite combos. We're going to play all of the broken, busted things we can. We're playing cutthroat, and we're playing to win. And nobody is going to be sad about it if they win or lose. Nobody's going to be sad if you blow up your land. Nobody's going to be sad if you stack us out, because we all understand the fundamental rule of the game. What the 4 letters of CEDH are is a summary shortcut of Rule Zero. It is basically, this is the Rule Zero conversation for this table. You already know all of the assumptions that come along with it, and so we can have a smooth game. What I'm trying to do, and what the RC is trying to do, is try to bring that shorthand to the rest of Commander. And that's where the challenge is, because like, we all know what like garbage tier my first deck is, and we all know what CDH tier decks are. It's a nebulous middle that is very, very objective. And that's where you have to use your words to explain what's going on.
When you're talking about this kind of thing, I think it's important to point out that the Rule Zero conversation is not a replacement for something else that we already have. It's something that's added on to make the experience more pleasurable for everyone. It's not a replacement for the ban list. It's not a replacement for the people who make the rules or the people who design the cards.
Yeah, that's one of my pet peeves, is like, people are like, oh, you have a Rule Zero, then why do we need a ban list? Can't we just agree that these cards don't work? I'm like, no, of course we can't. We're humans. Humans don't agree on things like that. Do you think if we didn't have a baseline ban list, there's no way people are going to be like, yeah, I'm just going to not play these cards. Some cards are just not okay for multiplayer format, or like they're just not okay for the playstyle that we want to encourage. And those are the cards we remove from the format. If you take away the ban list entirely, then everybody's going to be pub stomping all the time, even accidentally. And we don't want people to sit down at their like friendly table with an Aruth deck and then be like, or like with their Leovold deck and throw out like a bunch of wheels or something. It's like, come on, that's not fun. I think part of the idea here, we are trying to remove this notion of casual versus competitive, because That's also not a useful tool. We're trying to remind people that Commander's entire purpose is to be a social game. And social games need social solutions. You can't ban list your way out of a social problem. You can't force your way out of a social problem. You've got to actually use social solutions. And that means talking to people. Olivia Gilbert Hicks on the rules committee, she likes to say that rule zero is for game two more than game one. Like game one, we sit, we play, we feel each other out. Game two, we're like, okay, you know what? I didn't really like the vibe of that deck. Maybe this isn't the kind of flavor we're looking for out of our experiences going forward. And they can be like, yeah, okay, well, I'll bring these other decks instead. Or, I'll go find a different group that more suits what I'm trying to do. I don't necessarily agree with that fully, but it does give a good understanding of what we're trying to go for.
If you'd like to expand on that a little bit more, I've had this conversation with Lion and a few other people where I think that post game conversation is way more informative and useful because everyone's gotten
100%,
to be in their
100%.
feelings and like understand what happened. And you're going to have a lot of games where people have built decks for the first time or just a new precon. And you don't really know how to evaluate it and not know how to communicate very clearly what's going on. After you played with it, everybody got a chance to see a little bit and build on your experience and have that frame of reference because a lot of times in a blind pod, you're just not going to have that frame of reference to know what everybody's doing, what their idea of power level is.
That is 100% true. Like that's the whole point here is like that Olivia is making, which is that to give you an example, MagicCon Chicago, I had built a Kadira deck. Kadira is the ogre lady who, when you attack, she makes a ton of tokens and then makes more tokens based on how many tokens you have. And it gets really out of control quickly. And I sat down with the table and I'm like, look, and I was sitting with a table full of friends of mine. And I was like, hey guys, I don't know if this is a good or a bad deck yet. I've literally just built it and never tried it. I feel like it could be strong, but I'm just giving you a heads up right off the top that this deck might be ridiculous. And if it is, I apologize and we could swap it and take it up. And they're like, yeah, sure, let's give it a try. At the end of the game, I had something like 600 tokens in play and I just kind of ran the table. And everybody knew going in that this was a possibility that was happening. So nobody felt bad. Nobody had any, oh man, what the hell? You just came to like a powder puff table with a bulldozer. There was none of that. It was just like upfront. I'm like, look, I just built this. I don't know what it does yet. Be prepared.
Right.
And then at the end of the game, we sat and we had a little conversation like, okay, that was way more powerful than I thought. Now I know better where it would go. And next time I'll bring it, I'll play it at a different table. That's really the best kind of rule zero conversation. Like, I don't need to tell you, I don't need a PowerPoint slide of like, I'm not okay with extra turns, or I know we were going to get into this later, but I'm going to get on soapbox right now. There's this notion, rule zero, when we introduce it as a very simple concept. Talk to the other people, tell them what you're interested in, tell them what kind of vibe you're going for, and then decide if you're going to play or not. Somebody in writing that rule used the example of, oh yeah, like let's say you want to play silver bordered cards. Maybe it's like, hey guys, I have some silver bordered cards in that deck. Is that okay or not? Like that's part of a rule zero conversation. That's fine. People took that, and sometimes it feels like we type things and then people will go into it like a Talmud and try to just start really evaluating the essence of the words we're saying. And I'm like, it's not that complicated. But basically what it ended up being is there were people who would either just blatantly lie and say like, oh yeah, it's 7 and then just, crush the table, or B, would start to use rule zero as a bludgeon. Oh, your deck is like, mean and cruel and you're messed up and you're doing all this like evil stuff and I don't want to play with it. You didn't have this. I'm like, dude, no, rule zero is not a PowerPoint discussion of you telling everybody, I'm not okay with stacks. I'm not okay with extra turns. I'm not like, no, that doesn't matter. That's not what rule zero is for. You're not here to rebuild their deck for them. The whole point is if they're playing with a deck that you don't want, the solution is to change your table or find a different game or do something else, not to be like badgering people because they're playing a style that you don't like. That was one of the things that really irked me about the way Rule Zero ended up getting adopted, is that instead of being a tool for communication and for understanding, people were using it more as like the law by which to like slap people on the wrist. And I'm like, that's not what we want.
It's not a checklist to find the perfect partner. Like you're trying to roughly find a pod that's going to be fun for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're just trying to say like, yo, man, I'm playing a slow deck, I'm playing a fast deck. Done.
Situations like that are very easy. And I think the most of the situations like this are easy. I think people blow it far out of proportion when you have more complicated decks. And like you said, it's very nebulous in that middle gray area, especially the closer you get to high power without getting into true blue CDH, I think is where people tend to misevaluate their decks, and that's fine. It's okay to be wrong as long as you learn from it and try to communicate. That's the number one word here, always communicate. But people tend to use that rule zero as kind of a, like you said, as a bludgeon to try to enforce this particular play style or this particular trying to curate the experience so far down that you're never going to find a game. Go
It's
go look on
super
Reddit for
annoying.
any of like the custom ban lists and tell me that it doesn't make you cringe because they clearly are trying to curate their experience, which is fine in a local place. But when you're trying to completely change the game for
I
everybody
think
to suit your needs, that's where you're kind of abusing the privilege a little bit.
I think custom ban lists are a little different because those are stores and areas that have agreed to play by those rules. I think that's actually a perfect application of Commander. It's like, hey, we have a store meta. Here are the cards that we have found in our store meta that are just not working for us or just like get abused, or Tim over there just keeps making these busted decks. Fine. In our approved in-store meta, we're just going to not allow that. I think that's great. What I don't like is if you're sitting down at a store with somebody strange and you don't know and you're not part of an agreed meta and they pull out a deck and you just start like frowning at them or something, or if you didn't communicate up front, and if you do communicate and they're just like, this is what it is, don't play. You don't have to play. There's nothing forcing you to play. I said many times, the only prize in Commander is getting a second game. Getting to do it again, making new friends, playing it again, playing a second game is the only prize. So if you're not having fun, don't play that first game because you don't want the second game, right? Like that's not going to be fun for you if you're already not having fun now. It irks me when, just as bad as like flouting Rule Zero or like just saying like, oh, you guys need to abolish Rule Zero. I'm like, how do I in a social multiplayer game tell people not to talk?
Hmm.
Like, don't be an idiot, please. There's this balance where it's like too little of the law leads to anarchy, too much of the law leads to fascism. Rule Zero is not for fascists or anarchists. It's for people to just sit and say, like, hey guys, just want to play a game. Is this the game that you want to play? I don't know.
It's so funny how we we go into like this custom experience is perfectly okay, and it still boils down to the simple: is this what you guys want to do? Because this is what I want to do. And
It's 100% that. Like, I sat down in Command Fest San Francisco, and a friend of mine brought out this deck, which was like, it had contraptions, it had silver border, it had all these things. He's like, look, this is my Rule Zero deck. It's powerful, but it's silly. It does these doofy things. It's got a couple of these cards in it that are busted, but they're not going to do anything weird. And I'm like, I want to see what you've got. And I sat down and we had a great time. Whereas there have been times when folks are like, hey, you know what? I've got this deck that I'm using Planeswalkers as a commander. And I'm like, I don't really want to play against that. And they're like, all right, great. I've got this other legend. I'll just slot in on the top. No problem. We're moving on. Two Rule Zero communications that were totally successful. One of the stories I like to tell, early on in 2016 or something, when I was really getting into Commander, I brought my Tajik deck, which was a terrible soldiers deck that was super themed and super fancy looking. And I sat down at a table at a store with three people who knew each other. And they were playing what was unlabeled at the time, but effectively early CDH decks. So they had like Leovold wheels, they had like extra turns locks, they had the whole thing. And I'm sitting here playing this soldiers red white soldiers deck, and I'm just, for years I thought these guys had just bullied me out of the game and smashed me. And what I didn't realize until like a decade later was like, no, dude, I actually sat down with my like plum pudding deck at a table full of people with like buzz saws, and I'm mad at them for not bringing plum pudding. Like, like what the problem here was me the whole time, which is that I sat there and I ruined their day and their experience because I didn't ask them what kind of decks they were playing. I didn't understand when they explained it to me, and I brought my literal worst possible deck that I could to the table. And so I just basically wasted their time because they don't want to sit and just, like, it's not fun to kick a puppy. They want to play against somebody who's challenging them. If I go up to a pro tour and I'm sitting there against these pro players and I bring my like intro deck or something, a precon, they're going to be like, what the hell are you doing, man? Like, why are you here? Rule Zero helps us avoid that. It helps us get to situations where we're not wasting each other's time.
let me ask you, how would you, from the perspective of someone in that play group, how would you say to someone or communicate to them that you're not having a good time because their deck is not up to the power level that the rest of the pod is? Is that like, that feels like it feels bad, right?
Yeah. The way I would think about it we would sit down and like 2 or 3 turns in, you would know. Like you can know with a commander deck within a handful of turns whether this is going to be the right deck or not for the table. At that point, I would have probably just like stopped and been like, your deck doesn't seem very high powered. We're not too far into the game. I can lend you one of my high power decks, or maybe this isn't the pod for you. It's not going to be a good time for any of us. I've done that before. I've just straight up stopped games and been like, hey, you know what? I think we're not on the same page here. So let me help you get to the same page, or let me switch decks to make it more your speed if you don't have any others. This is not going to be a pleasant time. And I would rather we sit and we restart before it gets too long in.
That's probably the best case scenario, is that everybody can kind of get on the same power level at that time. I do worry about that out in the wild. I think that's kind of more of a problem where you're running into players who are maybe just getting into Magic or not that into Magic, and they picked up a pre-con and they want to jump in a pod. I think that's going to be a little bit tough for them to understand because they don't have a frame of reference, right? So that's something I think that people should really keep in mind, because I see this happening all the time. It's happened to me plenty of times, both in my game store and just bring people into my play groups where they come in, they're obviously playing like a lower power deck, and you don't want to kick the puppy and you don't want to throw the game either just so that they have a good time. I have a whole episode about sandbagging, and we talked about how it's just, it feels bad all around.
It
So
is.
I really think that rule 0 there is even more important, because you have to communicate with people with a different frame of reference than you, and try to make it,
Yes.
try to make them understand that, like, hey, I'm not trying to bully you or say your deck is bad, but you're going to have a worse time than you would if we were all on the same page.
Right. That's exactly it. And the thing is, that is very hard. And sometimes it really does take that first game for them to understand. If I see someone who's obviously new and they've sat down in a pod and like 2 or 3 turns in, we know that this is not going to go well, then it behooves us to tune down our decks, right? Like not sandbag, not hold the thing down. Every commander player worth their salt's got like 2 decks on them. It is a cliche. And I realize this is not a universal experience. Bring a precon or something, just throw it in the backpack. If you just happen to run into somebody who's playing obvious precon tier, you'll be like, hang on a second, let me just pull out this deck instead. And we can just start over. Like a lot of people are loath to start over because they're like, oh, it's a sunk cost. I don't want to pitch like the whole thing and go through all the massive shuffling and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I get that. But again, if we're communicating, if we're talking up front, then that's not going to happen. We're not going to start the game, let alone get deep into it and realize that we're out of sorts. If that person's like, yo, I just got this precon and I'm starting, and I'm like, okay, this probably isn't the table that you're going to have fun at. It's not like being mean as much as just being real and being honest and being respectful. A lot of things, it's weird that Commander is such a hugely social format played by people who don't understand kind of the fundamentals of being respectful. It's like,
I can
come
already
on, man.
feel the heat in the comment section.
We're Magic players. We talk all the time. I can narrate the entire stack and all the triggers and everything that's going on. I can be nice to you too. It's okay. Everybody's like, oh, I don't want to, like baby them. Like, I'm not asking you to baby them. I'm just saying, like, be respectful, man. Like, the same way you would be at a tournament, you're respectful to your opponent when you're sitting down and playing. Why wouldn't you be respectful to your opponent here?
Yeah, I mean, it's just like anything else. Like, if you can imagine yourself in that situation, or remember a time where you were new to anything, like, you wouldn't want to, say you like playing with RC cars, and you go to a function and you realize you're completely out of your league. You would, you'd want somebody to talk to you about it. You wouldn't want somebody to just like, hey, buddy, you don't belong here. Like, it just doesn't make any sense to introduce somebody to the game like that.
If I'm in an arcade and I just started playing Street Fighter and I just learned how to play it, and I go up and I see the line of quarters and I put my quarter down and I go up and I fight against the local end boss and I get shellacked. That is going to teach me that, okay, when there's a line of quarters up there and there's a bunch of people who are playing hardcore, maybe this isn't the scene for me. Maybe I need to wait until there's a more relaxed play style or something, or I need to get good real quick. Commander, it's not an F&M tournament. This is a social game. There's multiple different ways to play. So if you're sitting down in the pod and you're getting shellacked, find a different pod. One of the things I believe I've got these 2 axioms that I like to use, which is, one is you are responsible for the fun of the other people at your table in a Commander pod. And 2 is you are responsible for understanding yourself and what your needs and desires are while you're sitting down to a Commander pod. Which is to say, don't be the person who drags down the pod for everybody else. and don't be the person who's just ruining the game for that one person who's not fitting in. There's this balance we have to walk, which is like we need to find where's the place that we're all going to be comfortable playing and be there. And if we're not, then don't start the game. It's
It's
weird. I
right.
know it sounds weird for me to be like, "Hey, your best way to play Commander is not to play at all," but don't want people to go home feeling bad. I would rather that you're like, "Oh, you know what, man? That sucks, and I didn't get to play," rather than, "Man, I spent 3 hours and I got nothing. The Iona locked me out of the game, and I just sat there and couldn't get anybody to ruin it, kill it for me."
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe it's hard to envision the time before a game because when you go out to play Magic, that's all you're really thinking about is the actual game. So I think the idea of this conversation being a part of it is maybe something that people just aren't used to. I don't know why. One thing I actually really wanted to ask you about was people who have concerns where they have to give away information about their deck where they feel like it's going to make it not fun or it's not going to be as competitive if people know their gimmicks. Like, how much information do you think is like a good amount to give away? Like, do you think that like average turn you pop off is like a valid metric, or is that
No.
too like obscure?
I've been playing Magic for 30 years. If you ask me what turn a deck wins on, I couldn't tell you.
I
I have
couldn't
no
either.
goddamn idea,
I've heard that
especially
all the time, and I've never
it's
actually
such
been
a
able to do it.
BS stat, especially in Commander. In a two-player game, if I'm playing in like a structured vintage legacy tournament, whatever, I can tell you, oh yeah, this deck will win on turn 3 because it's got a combo, it's got 4 cards, it's got like a linear progression. In EDH, there are 100 cards in your deck, and there are 300 other cards that have not been in that exact configuration ever. There's no way for me to know what they're going to play versus what I'm going to play. I have no idea what deck my turn wins on. My deck will win on a turn 120 in a void, right? Like
Right.
that's I think a lot of it is super overblown by people who are like, "Oh, I don't want to bring a PowerPoint spreadsheet to my game," or "I don't want to tell them every card in my deck." Like, no, don't. Nobody cares. Nobody wants to know. None of that is useful or helpful information at all. This is not a competitive format. There's no competitive edge to be gained by looking at your deck list. Who cares?
It's open
What you
deck
should
lists as
do,
far as I'm concerned. I usually
yeah,
hand
like
people my deck instead of trying to tell them what's in it. I'm like, "Here, take a look at this and tell me if it's scary."
even that's not really like whatever. Here's basically the fundamental baseline of what I think is important. Who is your commander? And then are you trying to win fast or slow? I don't need to know turn. Is your goal to try to like dirtle and do cool things, or are you like, is this a deck meant to be powerful and win quickly? That's pretty simple and pretty straightforward. Some people get granular, like, how many tutors are you playing? It doesn't matter.
That's
Like, if you're
kinda where
playing
I'm at.
tutors,
I
like, if you're
I
playing, like, yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
that's really like, for me, that's like a concrete thing you can say is, "Do I have tutors? Do I have fast mana?" And that's kind of like related to the power level conversation, but it's like, should I expect you to be a turn ahead of me right out of the gate? Or should I expect you to be able to win the game in a moment's notice? Like, that's kind of like
Right.
shorthand for those questions. Do you
Yeah.
play tutors in your deck or like diabolic tutor, but like 2 mana tutors,
Demonic
the
tutor
fast
and like
ones?
vampiric tutor.
Yeah. I
I
find
mean,
that's
look,
really helpful actually for seeing
yeah, I think
where
so.
I'm at.
Okay, that's fair. Like, but the thing is, like, I don't need to know how many tutors you have. But if you're like, hey, you know what? I have like a combo and I'm tutoring for it and I'm trying to win. For me, that feels a little gimmicky, but it is a good shorthand. None of
Mm.
my decks run tutors, but even my most powerful decks are very powerful still. I just don't like tutors because I want to play commander and I don't want to
'Cause
have
we
a
like playing the
consistent
singleton
experience.
format that we're in.
Yeah, like I don't want a consistent experience. That's not what I'm here for. Look, you could say like, yo, I'm playing a bunch of tutors. Okay, fine. Then I know you're kind of going for something strong. But really, knowing your commander and whether it's fast or slow will generally tell me everything I need to know. If you're like, oh yeah, man, I'm playing a Kali of the Vast deck and it goes super fast. I'm like, okay, then I know you're gonna be playing tutors, you're gonna be playing crazy angels dropping out of nowhere. It's gonna be insane. I get it. This is a weirdly complicated question, right? Like how much of a deck do you need to know? How much does it matter? And like at what point does it cease to be we're having a conversation about playing together and it become into a you're policing my deck?
Mm.
I don't want a you're policing my deck, right? Like I don't want to get into a situation where people feel that your deck must be this tall to play or, whatever it is, right? Like I don't want people to feel like, oh yeah, we're playing here with like bumper cars and with like, guardrails, and if you're playing with anything stronger than a gray ogre, this you're a bad person. This should not be accompanied by judgment of character, which is too often what it becomes. It's like your deck is not your character. It is not a reflection of the person you are. It's just the deck you're playing. The Rule Zero conversation should not take more than a second, right? Like it should take more than like 1 minute of everybody being like, yo, this is the kind of deck I'm playing.
People want to believe that there's a lot of nuance behind it, and there's a little nuance behind it, but that's part of communication is like understanding what people mean when they say like it's a strong deck or I'm gonna win the game really fast. Like that's shorthand for I have strong cards in the deck, right?
Yeah.
So it really is that simple. I think people kind of use it as a replacement for being good people and communicating. This is actually something
No,
I complained about on Twitter recently, where people seem to say that Rule Zero is useless. Basically, that was the most recent thing because some guy was a dick in a pod, and that's not what it's for. Rule Zero doesn't stop that guy from being a jerk
no,
because
it
he's not
doesn't.
going to communicate with you honestly anyway. That pod just wasn't for you because you don't want to play with jerks.
A jerk is going to be a jerk no matter what. Like we can ban every card in the universe and they're going to find the most powerful cards that are left and win. Like I said, you cannot solve a social issue, and some people just aren't good at social. And you can't solve a social issue. I can't. There's no amount of rules litigation that I'm going to do that will make you enjoy this experience more with that person. Sometimes it's just not possible. In the Commander Discord, we have this kind of Rule Zero sample that we've got on an Autobot that just kind of gives people an idea of like a general notion of what we do. And basically, here's what it is. I am playing Commander, this Commander name. It is a blank, broad strategy type deck. It tends to do thing that it wants to do around turn number, whatever. It's built with these kind of restrictions or other like useful information like silver border cards or whatever. I prefer games that are lighter on things that you find less enjoyable in games with that deck. Now, I think that discussion there is almost more litigatory than I would want. I don't personally follow all of that, but I think it's at least a starting point. My Rule Zero discussion pre-game chat would be like, I'm playing a commander. Basically, my deck tries to win pretty quickly with aggressiveness, or this is more of a slow, dirty type of deck that I like to build this cool engine with. And that's it. Like, I don't know what turn I'm going to win on or anything, but I would be like, hey, you know what? I'm playing a graveyard themed deck, or like I'm playing an all artifacts deck or something. So if you have like, I don't know, Stony Silence or like Rest in Peace or whatever, let me know and I'll pick a different deck. What I'm doing is I'm putting the onus on myself instead of the onus on the other player, which is to say that's one of the big deals and one of the more important parts of communication here is that a lot of people will use Rule Zero to force other people to play the way they want. And that's wrong. What it should be is I am going to make these sacrifices of myself to make sure that we all have a better experience. Because then other people don't feel defensive and they don't feel bad about it, right? So in that sense, it would be like if you're sitting there saying like, "Yo, I'm playing a deck that's full of graveyard hate and full of like Stony Silence and stuff," then I'd be like, "Okay, hang on, I'm just gonna pull a different deck out so that we can have a better time." Instead of being like, "Hey, I would rather you change your deck for me." I think that is a big, big part of this, which is put the onus on yourself because it's your responsibility to have a good time as much as it's their responsibility to make sure everybody else have a good time.
I think that's a very selfless way of looking at it, and I hope that people put themselves like mentally in that scenario so they can understand that it's a better end for everybody. Because again, you wouldn't want to play; you'd rather play no game than a bad game. I think I can relate a little bit to this because this is something I do quite frequently with my play group, and I'm sure that at least one of them will listen to this and they'll think back to a few times I've done this, where everybody's picking out their commanders for the next game, and somebody brings out like their 1/1 deck or they bring out a graveyard deck, and the deck I was going to play was going to very obviously interact with them, and I'm just going to like quietly put my deck box away and pick one that's going to be more fun for for him especially, but I'm not going to have fun dunking on somebody because I know what their deck is and I'm meta picking around it. Like I want us
Right.
all to have a good time. So I'm just going to take that
Now, mind you,
responsibility there.
yeah, exactly. Now, if it's the end of the night and we all know that we're going to bring out our like trash compactor ruin lives decks, then yeah, I will definitely meta pick against you and just completely destroy your deck because we know, and that's a Rule Zero we've had that, hey, this is the last game and we're going to go full out. if you know that your friend's been testing out and working on an artifacts deck and they're here to try it out, and you sit there and you're like, okay, well, I've got, aura shards in this deck and I've got Stony Silence, I've got all these weird lock pieces, then maybe pull a different deck out. Maybe let them have their fun in a way that you will also have your fun. It's not fun for anybody if one person is just dragging the table down because they just can't do anything. That sucks. I don't want to sit here and just watch you. Like, unless we're playing CDH and my goal is to watch you do nothing and then die, that's not what I'm here for. In CDH, at least, I know that you are also here to watch me do nothing and die. That's like our mutual shared destruction of each other, right? Like, that's fine. I know what I want. I know what you want, and we can go and try to wreck each other. At a casual table, that's not what we want. What we want is to have fun, to make sure that the next 2 hours or whatever we spend together are a great time and that nobody feels like they wasted their time. It's not about fun or not. It's like, do you feel like your time was well spent? Losing can be just as fun as winning if you're in the right format and crazy things are happening and your deck got to pop off and then you got crushed. That's awesome. That's super fun. You did something. As opposed to like the time I went to a store and I saw a 6-person pod and one person was playing Iona and they named a color and the other person had just brought a monocolored precon and they were locked out of the game entirely and nobody else was playing that color or they had other ways to get around it and they just didn't bother removing it and that person just sat for an hour and did nothing. Right? Like, that's not fun.
Yeah, it's practical
That's not a
torture.
good time. No, that sounds miserable and that kid's going to go home and never come back.
Exactly.
Like,
it's bad for the format when you don't take care of your players.
yeah. All comes down to how much do you respect the people at the table you're sitting at? Do you respect them enough to be like, hey, let's have a good time? Or are they just obstacles in your way to get somewhere? And if they're obstacles in the way to get somewhere, then is Commander really the format you're looking for?
Probably not.
Like,
I think that you could use that as a line of perspective there too. Just like maybe the games I'm looking for is modern or legacy right now, and like I want to have a social time, but I'm not necessarily looking to have the experience that Commander players are looking to have right now.
I really want the other formats to thrive
Hmm.
because when the other formats are healthy, people feel like they have places to play the kind of Magic that they want to play, and they won't come to Commander and try to turn Commander into the game that they didn't get to play.
Do you
Like,
have an example of this that you want to share?
well, there's some folks I know who are like hardcore vintage players who are like, in my area, vintage and legacy have died out, and the only thing to do is Commander. And when I bring out my preferred deck from vintage and legacy, which is like, mono blue full control, nobody wants to play with me and everybody gets mad. And I'm like, I don't want to tell you not to do this, but I think Commander is not the format you're looking for. If you're looking for a format where people are okay with getting full locked out, this one's probably not it.
Probably not. If you find a pod that likes getting Mindslaver locked all the time, good for you, but nobody else wants to do that.
Today in cards that I really wish we could ban, but people just won't.
Oh,
I hate
I could go all night. I could go all night. Although I'm more on the unbanned train than anything, but mostly for cards that I think people don't think about. That's a whole different conversation. Although I do think that, if you rolled up to a pod with me and said, "Hey, I want to play this card that's on the ban list. I'm not doing necessarily anything to generate with it. I'm doing this unique interaction." I would probably say yes. Like, that's okay. Like,
Yeah, there's a lot of times I've done that. I mean, I think it's super cool. Like, Jim, who is literally on the rules committee, has a deck which has flash in it. And he uses it to do really silly and interesting and funny things. And it's not like I'm gonna flash in Protean Hulk and win. It's just like I'm using flash to do fun, cool things. And I think that's awesome. The ban list is a baseline, but it's also not meant to be a straitjacket. It's like, look, we just know these cards don't work well. Like, limited resources where everybody has to sack their lands down to 5, and then nobody is allowed to have more than 10 lands in the, or rather, the game is not allowed to have more than 10 lands. That is just bad for multiplayer. There's no good reason to have that free. But like, if you're gonna be sitting there and you're like, yo, you know what? I've got a really cool deck that uses whatever the mirror is, or like, coalition victory theme deck. Sure, I don't care. Go ahead, show me. If you're like, yeah, I want to play a Rule Zero deck with Leovold, I'm like, no, no, I know better.
right. That's the keyword there is that we rule zeroed it, and you said, yeah, we're not looking for that game. And you
Yeah.
might find a pod where that's okay, and that's great because I think that's
That's awesome. Go knock yourself out.
Yeah,
But it's not
you
going to
don't
be
have
here.
to adhere to the rules for 100% of all gameplay interactions. If your group wants to play nonsense, you want to play with Pokemon cards in your Magic
Well,
deck. I don't really like if you find a group that wants to do that.
please, we
That's your
call them
prerogative.
Theros Beyond Deathlands, not Pokemon cards.
I
But
have an
like the thing is,
Uncommander and I love it.
I think Unstable is one of the best sets they've ever made. There's so many fun things in there. I would not feel bad about people showing up with that. For me, the thing is more like Sheldon Menery used to say a thing that the rules are for untrusted groups. If you're in your trusted group which is a play group that you play with all the time, and you guys decide amongst yourselves that Paradox Engine is fine or Library of Alexandria is fine or whatever it is fine, rules working as planned. Go ahead, knock yourself out, have a great time. It's just to make sure that when you go to a store, you don't just shellac the kid who's playing against you. And I'll be honest, the ban list is not what I want. If I had my way, it would be like 3 times as long because I think it's not doing a good enough job of stopping kids from getting shellacked. But that's an issue I have with the rules committee and not with like the rules themselves. Still, though, having that conversation is just so important. It teaches you human life skills, like how to negotiate.
We say it's not hard because it's simple. I know like communication is like something that's different for everybody, especially in an unknown pod. If you go to a game store and there's 3 people you don't know, like it can be a little bit tough. Especially us Magic players, not the most known for being very socially adept creatures. It can be a little bit tough to talk to them and say like, this is the experience I'm looking for. If you're worried about how you look, or everybody has to have that experience, and you still can have that post game conversation if it wasn't lined up exactly with what your expectations were. That's the thing is you get to keep communicating. That's the best part about Magic is the Gathering, right? You get to keep communicating with the people you're playing with and have a good time and figure out what you like and what you don't like.
Commander is the biggest umbrella in Magic. You can have every flavor and color of playstyle here. We're not here to tell you what to do with that. I'm just here to make sure that you're having the best time you can have with it.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, the rules that we have are kind of the baseline for people to be able to get along. If you think of Rule 0 as being not necessarily we need to change how we're going to play and more we need to talk about what is going to be fun for everyone, it becomes a much more tempting conversation to have because you want to have fun, obviously. And it's a lot more fun if your opponents are also doing things and things are happening on the board and you're having counter wars, interactions happening. You wouldn't be playing Magic if you didn't like Magic. So I would hope. I would hope. Some people hate Magic and they play lots of Magic, it seems like, but I think if you're listening to this podcast, you probably love
I'm not
Magic.
here to judge.
Oh, speaking of that, I feel so bad for judges because I advocate for like uncommanders and things like that and weird rules interactions. I feel so bad for the judges who have to deal with that. But it's a casual game. You can do whatever you want.
Commander is built on hand wavium, right? Like it's all just like, it works. Don't trip too much about whether it works specifically or not. Like, who cares?
Yeah,
Just make it work.
I think I have more games where I've like messed up a rules interaction than games where I've never, not once, did that. So it's as long as everybody had fun, it doesn't really matter.
There's 4 decks in play. There's so many things going on. If you're not playing at the most like strict rules enforcement level, takesy backsies, whatever. Like don't abuse it. Just like be fine. If we all missed it, well, then we all missed it, right?
I don't rules lawyer people very often because I just want people to have a good time.
I mean, I will rules lawyer them if they're getting if they're pushing that boundary a bit. And I'm like, bro, that doesn't work the way, and it doesn't.
If you abuse the privilege, like if you're casting things and then as soon as you got some information, you take it back, that's just cheating. That's not cheating. Actually.
That's not like, oops, I didn't realize that thing had reach. It's like that's different.
I will rules lure you about Ward. Ward is, oh man, nobody likes to admit that they got by Ward. It happens. I've tried to counter a uncounterable Niv Mizzet before. It just happens sometimes. Sometimes you just make people.
I will give people like 1, unless it's like something egregious. But most of the time, I'll be like, look, you got 1 takesy backsy. Just better now. Pay attention.
Yeah, for sure. Everybody's attacked into like a death touch creature by accident or something.
Yeah, and sometimes you're just like, well, that sucks.
How do you feel about when people change how they tap their mana to pay for things because they realize they
I don't care at all. Man, I am the sloppiest mana tapper in the world. I just assume that if you've got the right amount of colors and shapes in there, I don't care. If you're gonna be like, oh crap, let me retap my mana to cast this other spell I've got, fine.
I
Like
don't
we're
mind too
playing
much
Commander,
in paper.
I'm not fastidious about that because I do it all the time too. It's just like whatever. If we're playing in a game where every action we take matters fundamentally, then yeah, I will be very fastidious about my mana. But otherwise, I'll be like, if you tap wrong and you're like, oh, can I just do this the other way? Yeah, that's fine. Whatever.
Yeah, most people screw up
Unless you draw a card after the attack or something, or after casting a
Yes,
spell, and then
absolutely.
you're like, oh, let me redo my mana. I'm like, no, 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 no. That's
Yeah,
different.
that's just poor planning on your part.
Yeah, but if it's more like, hey, I played this spell and I'm like, oh crap, I tapped the wrong land. Okay, I'll take back. Who cares?
Yeah,
We're not arena.
I think in paper, it's a lot more pertinent to be flexible with that because people have to actually hold their cards up and look at them physically.
Yeah, it's
'Cause when I'm playing, like,
harder than
Magic
you think.
Online, I'm much more aware of what mana I need because I see all the pips right below where my lands are. I think it makes you a better player in that way. Obviously, you can get punished on
I think
Magic
Magic
Online.
Online. Yeah, I think Magic Online forces you to be real fastidious about it. Magic Arena makes you very lazy.
One of the things I
uh,
hate about Arena is the auto tapper, for
well,
sure.
I mean, find me a person who likes the auto tapper, and it'll find you the person who made the auto tapper. Nobody else does. I've been playing a lot of Chandelar, and Chandelar teaches you how to play Magic with old rules, but it's also like, hey, guess what? You better tap your land right because it's not going to let you take it back ever, and you're going to take
Mhm.
mana burn, and you're going to be like, oh, I just
Oh, goodness,
ate 7
Monburn.
points of damage because I tapped the wrong land. Yeah, Chandelar does not care. GG's, buddy. You should learn.
Just reminded me that I need to, build Yearlock as well. I need people to
God,
be
your
afraid
luck.
of mana burn and,
You know what,
tapping the mana
man?
around.
Your luck is so funny because people are just like so lazy with their mana, and they're
You
like, oh
don't
yeah, I'm just gonna
realize how
stack all these
often you
treasures.
just
It's like
float a mana and waste it until you start doing it.
until you start eating it, and then it's like, oh, this is ow. Okay,
My
hang on.
playgroup often, jokes about having 4 people all playing Yearlock and just seeing who gets burned out the fastest. And you would think that
I
having a
would imagine
mana
a
sink.
four-player Urlock deck would end up being incredibly slow and turbo cautious, almost like a mono blue mirror, just because everybody's afraid of tapping their lands. That
Well,
would be
it's
so funny.
oh, man, I could just imagine. It's really a shame because you can't play, like, mana short in those
Oh yeah, I
decks.
know. I miss mana short or
Yeah,
like smoke or not smoke. Power surge, where it's like
Power
you take
Surge.
damage for each untapped land or something you have in play.
It's such a fun time. I think that, like, a 4-player game would either be really slow or it'd be, like, very turbo where everybody is just trying to use up all their mana. I mean, obviously,
Mm.
Yearlock has 1 mana sink, but you have to put mana in your pool after you activate it, so it doesn't really work.
Your luck does not give you a lot of outs.
I don't think I've seen Yearlock, though, since it got made. Man, imagine Yearlock with blue.
God, I wish. Oh my God, mana short would be right back.
It's been one of my biggest, I don't
Power
wanna say
sync.
criticisms because this is clearly done on purpose, but I really hate when they make commanders that do an effect that is known to be really, like, interactive and strong in a certain color and exclude that color. I know they do it on purpose, so you have to be creative about it, but man, does it grind my gears when it's like, "This deck would be perfect if I could play this
Like,
one
why
card."
is this energy Jeskai and not Teamer? Come on. It's like,
Oh, don't even get me started. I'm
anyways.
so glad we're getting more energy cards, but man, it's the worst, and I don't think you could, like, stretch a conversation that far to say, like, "Hey, let me play my favorite commander, but add a color," and I know that's been a topic of conversation lately.
There is rule zero and then there's no.
Now you're just playing in pretend land.
Yeah,
You might as
now
well be
we're
playing make a custom card commander.
at that point, you might as well just partner it, like have a rule zero partner with that stupid Baldur's Gate thing that lets you pick a second color
Hmm.
from Commander Legends or whatever. The thing that give you a partner for the color that you don't have in the draft.
Ooh, I'm forgetting the name. I know I have this card in, etched foil, though,
Yeah,
for
it's like
whatever
the
reason.
colorless stupid card. God, now I gotta
Yeah, it would
look.
be it's really a shame that we can't really explore this that often because this would be like you have to convince 4 people to let you have this conversation where you're like, "Hey, it's totally cool. I can
Prismatic
be
Piper.
trusted with this degenerate color combo."
Prismatic Piper. That's what it is.
Prismatic Piper.
If it's your commander, you choose a color before it begins, and it's a chosen color, and that's it.
Yeah, it's kind
And
of
then
like
there's one in Baldur's Gate too.
this is another thing.
Faceless one is in Baldur's Gate. The legendary enchantment commander lets you choose a color and choose a background. But anyways, the thing is though, no, I'm not going to let you add a color. Like that's not going to happen. Just pick a 5-color commander then.
That's something I hate too. Is when commanders are 5 colors for a specific like theme, because oftentimes it's well, I'm just gonna play the best the best cards in these
Oh, it
colors.
always ends up being 5-color good stuff, and I hate that. I'm
Yeah,
like, this is dumb and boring.
it's very rare that a 5 color deck is going to be totally all in on the theme and not be playing good stuff. I think that like Rhystic Study is a good example of this. Is like if you're playing blue, you're probably playing Rhystic Study. And my personal playgroup has had conversations where we've considered not playing certain cards. And I know some playgroups will like soft ban Soul Ring and stuff like that. And I don't know. I just it's so hard for me to build a deck that's for one specific pod or even like a local game store that I like couldn't bring to another place and play it and not be at a disadvantage.
It just depends on who you are and who you play most often with. That's just it. It's like, are you playing with these people all the time? You guys are going to make decks for each other.
Hmm.
If you're like me and you end up playing with a lot of people, then you're not going to do that because we have like, because I just have a lot of different people I play with. So I just keep baseline decks to play with.
Hmm.
But a lot of the time, people come to me with these kinds of like rules issues, or like change this rule or ban this card or something, is because they want to force their playstyle on other people. And I'm like, no, dude, do it with your group and leave the rest of us alone.
Hmm.
It's fine.
It's very bold to say that a card should be banned or a rule should be changed just because you think so. Like who is one person to decide for every single person playing the format? It's
Well,
very
that's the thing
funny.
a lot of people have said to me as a member of the rules committee is like, who are you? What makes you? Well, I'm on the committee. That's what makes me.
It's crazy. I see it all the time too, mainly on Twitter because that's where all the discourse happens. But it's hard to believe these people exist sometimes. That narrow-minded. I don't mean to like insult anybody here because you can like listen to this and like have a different perspective. Like you're not a bad person, but how do you get to the point where you're saying, I think I don't know, Ob Nixilis, the newest Rakdos one, should be banned because it's unfun to play against pingers. So many people like playing pingers. You want to just ruin the game for everybody that wants to play that play style because you like playing 1/1s. It's just not realistic at all.
One thing that being on the CAG has taught me is that people do not have a very good notion of the perspective from a mile up, right? Like they don't have a very good bird's eye view of what it means to ban a card for a format. They're just thinking of their immediate play group or of their like immediate area or their region or whatever, and never about like how is this going to impact the literal 2 million people that play Commander,
Hmm.
right? Like,
That aren't on Twitter and are playing at their
yeah,
kitchen table.
like, and everyone's like, why did you ban this card? It's not, it's totally fine in my group. I'm like, they keep playing it in your group. However, we noticed that in the grand scheme of Magic, this is a bad idea for the format. That's a different issue, though. Like I don't begrudge people that because like it's hard unless your job is to think about it like that.
Hmm.
It's hard to see that sort of thing, and I respect that.
Yeah, well, that's why you gotta have the conversation in the public spaces, even if it is the cesspool known as. Well,
Well,
it's
that's
not
why
even
I'm
known as
very
Twitter
patient.
anymore. It's X now, but
No, it's Twitter. Nobody's gonna call it X.
I think they
But like
still have
I'm
the
very
redirects
patient.
broken.
Yeah, I do. I am never going to stop calling it Twitter. The point is, it's more like I don't begrudge anybody, and that's why I'm always very patient with people who are coming to me and talking to things. It's like they all have their perspective, and they're not going to have the perspective from a format level. My job is to be the one to help them understand that, and that's fine. I know what I'm here for.
You're not being a stickler. You're
I'm just trying
and
to say, like, look, this is why these things happen. Sometimes you don't agree, and that's also fine.
yeah, I
Like, I
mean, we're
don't
not
always
100
agree.
percent right about everything all the time
Well, I
either.
am.
If we were, we'd have the perfect ban list, which doesn't exist.
I mean, I do have the perfect ban list. They just won't let me implement it. You
I
know how
don't
much
think
better this game would be if it did exactly what I wanted and made only the decisions that were fun for me?
I don't know. A lot of people try. A lot of people certainly try, and good on them for like trying something different. And like people do no ban lists commander games fairly frequently from what I've seen.
But there's only so many times you want to deal with I'm gonna vault key and then win.
Yeah,
Like,
I think it's
great.
really interesting because people often will take advantage of it to build powerful things, but they don't necessarily go for things that are just annoying. Most people, I don't think, want to play with like a. I'm glad it's
Yeah,
banned,
seriously.
but most people I feel like don't want to play with that card anyway, which is good. I think that's good that we mostly agree. That's for most things on the ban list, right? Is like we all mostly agree that this card makes for non games or makes for unenjoyable games. Have you seen Worldfire since it was unbanned?
Nope.
I put it in exactly one deck and I took it out because it was very bad.
It's not a good card. I
It's
mean,
not a good card.
I don't think it should have been unbanned, but at the same time, it's also like it's not doing anything. Nobody's going to be crying about Worldfire.
Yeah, I think if
It's
you pay
but
9 mana for a spell, like something crazy should happen.
the fun one is people are like, well, you unbanned Worldfire, you should unban Sway of the Stars. I'm like, Worldfire at least ends a game. Sway
Mm.
of the Stars resets the game at 7, and that's just stupid and annoying. And I'm
Yeah,
like,
it's just
that's not
obnoxious.
the same at all.
Yeah, Goldfire, I think I put in my Anya deck, new Anya, not old Anya, because she could drain. And I'm like, oh, I could Worldfire and then drain and win the game that way.
Yeah,
It
good
was it
luck.
was such a silly thought, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna play with this card just because it's unbanned, and try it out. And quickly realized that it's like I never want to see this card because it is never really that good for me, and it's just not, you
It's
know.
not good and it's not fun.
Yeah, anytime I've had would have had the opportunity to cast it, it would have been fine because the game had gone on long enough that I had 9 mana in a fairly casual deck. But it's just people really think that if you unban something, it'll be meta or it'll be good for the format, and oftentimes it's bad or neutral at best.
Or worst case, they don't have the experience of having played against this card the first time, or have only seen it in like Cube or something and don't understand how utterly destructive it would be to the format to have this thing free.
Yeah,
Like,
Magic
or
30
like,
years
hey,
old,
this
guys.
stronger card exists. I'm like, that's a good reason to ban that card, not a good reason to unban a slightly weaker card. Because it's slightly weaker is still super strong.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think that like cards? I often hear the phrase like "this card died for this card's sins." Do you think
That's
that
never happened.
it's
That
definitely
doesn't
never
happen.
happened? Surely
No,
not.
people
I've
like to say that sort of thing because we announced ban lists and like, here's the bans and unbans, and people think, oh, they must discuss them together. Like Iona came on the ban list and Painter Servant came off the ban list. In those discussions, we never talked about them in conjunction with each other. In hindsight, yeah, it looks very obvious that those two cards are connected. But we were talking about Painter Servant more in the, oh, this would be fun for weird, quirky Johnny players. And it's like nobody's going to be Painters grindstoning anybody out. And there was a really cool Painter Servant that I just printed in the inventions. And I was like, man, that's this card's not going to see play. It's totally fine. It's totally fine. Iona, on the other hand, locks people out of the game forever. And they're like, oh, Iona died so that Painter Servant could be free. I'm like, I could see how you'd think that, but that's not what happened. They were discussions that were held like entirely independently of each other and just did not have any, they had no connection.
Do you think that's a valid strategy to let things off the list because they?
No,
I
it
think
just
that's
doesn't
more
work
of a
that
thing
way.
in Yu-Gi-Oh, where things come off the list that were problems because there's just better solutions to them. I found that Wizards is really good at actually printing solutions to problems instead of banning cards, which is my preference. I prefer to have more cards available and just have better answers and more interaction. But a lot of people don't seem to agree with me on that, so I might be completely off
One
base.
of the problems is that when you're building a commander deck, it's not like building a different deck for a different format where you've got sideboards where you got 4X cards where you're changing your deck regularly. Commander decks tend to be built to be forever decks. And forever decks, you got all the slots have been meticulously mapped out, and you don't really have a lot of flex space and room. And yeah, maybe it's a better deck building decision to take this one card out and replace it with a meta card that's going to remove the one problem that you're having. But people don't think like that. It's an emotional decision when you're building a commander deck. You're like, every slot in this deck is some cool thematic card that's going to make my thing do a thing. I don't want to take any of those slots away so I can have the one protection card or whatever. And a lot of like, refugees of other formats come into Commander, look and sit there and say, like, you guys are awful. You keep making these decks that have no means of defending yourself. And then you get mad when people interact with you. Well, yeah,
Mm.
Commander's an emotion game. It's not a logics game. It's an emotions and socials game. And people do get really salty when you get like stop them from doing the thing that they've worked so hard to put together. Because like nobody thinks, and that is one of the big problems with Commander, but it's also the selling point of Commander, which is that like nobody is thinking about how their deck will survive three other people. When you're building your deck, you're building, I've got this cool commander, I've got this cool theme, I've got these cool synergies cards, I've got these cool cards I've been holding on to for a decade that I've been looking for a deck to find. I've slotted them in, I've built this entire perfect, immaculate engine. And then you play it against someone else and they're counterspell your core card and exile it. And you're like, oh, nobody builds their deck with that in mind. It's like the third game you play when you start to actually take things out and be like, oh, okay, let me actually slot in real removal, or whatever it is. That's a lot to ask because Commander players aren't thinking like that. They're like, what are the fun things I could be playing? Commander is living in magical Christmas land, right? Like that's the entire purpose. That's what the format was made to do.
That is one of my favorite quotes I think I'll ever hear from you.
It's like, look, when you sign up to play Commander, you are signing up to be one of Santa's helpers. Like that's the whole point.
I totally agree. I think it's like more of a deck building skill to understand like you need interaction. Although I think that people often conflate having a bad time in Commander with being interacted with in Commander. This is a problem I've had in my own playgroup, even where I have a deck that I love dearly, interacts a lot. That's what it does, and people sometimes tell me after the game like I didn't have fun that game because your deck was interacting a lot with my deck, and it just wasn't prepared for it. And I'm not really sure like how would you approach that situation? It's like I love this deck, and I don't think it's necessarily you're having a bad time because you didn't get to play because your deck wasn't prepared for what my deck does. Where do you tote that line?
That's just a part of life, man. That's Commander. That's what happens.
And I love when people interact with me.
I
When
don't.
people interact with my permanents and on the stack, like I want that to happen. That's what makes
I
the
live
games
my life on the
interesting.
battlefield, baby. Sorcery speed is the only way.
Yeah, I'm not interested in just resolving my spells all the time and never having any consequences. I love when people interact with me.
It took me a long time to get into that mindset and to change my mindset from I've built this immaculate machine and I wanted to go off to I've built this immaculate machine and now I've also got like a handful of ways to stop people from blowing up my immaculate machine. But it took years and years of going through that. Like it takes time. It takes people a lot of time and a lot of reps of Commander to be able to break through that idea of building an immaculate machine and being able to be like okay with people plowing your one. Like that's when you learn to build redundancies. That's when you learn to build card synergies that are not just these two specific cards and nothing else. And that's called deck building experience. That's called the experience of playing. That just comes from reps. A lot of times Commander players build a deck, play it once and never again. They take it apart. It either did the thing it was supposed to do
Far too
or it
often.
didn't do the thing and they killed them and they moved on. The only way to solve that is be like, yo, you know what? Well, next time you'll have a better understanding of what your deck does.
I'm sure that'll go over well.
Because remember, the best thing you could do in that case is they're salty and they're in their feelings. They're not directing at you. I mean, yeah, you interact with them. Sometimes just let the wave crash over you. It's fine. Let them get it out. They're angry because their thing didn't do the thing. Chill.
I shouldn't say never, but there's very rarely going to be an even distribution of fun, if you can imagine it like that. Someone's going to do a little bit more sometimes.
Yeah, but it's just a matter of how kind are you? How respectful are you afterwards? When people are feeling like this, sometimes the kindest thing you can do is just let them, and sometimes the kindest thing to do is just help them and be like, hey, you know what? If you change a few of these cards into more protective spells, I think you'll have a better time. Because nobody wants to see their baby go run out into the street and get like, hit by a car, right? Like
I love the visuals. We're kicking puppies, we're running over babies.
I mean, look, dude, that's a lot of time Commander decks are people's babies. They built this whole thing.
Yeah,
They're launching it, and then
like, yeah.
There's a lot of decks that just the idea does not translate from page to play, right? You have to sit there. That is a self-awareness thing. Eventually, you got to learn to take your lumps. Some level of feel bad for them, but then also at the same time, it's like their job is to learn. Sometimes you have to be a tough parent. Your kid comes home with a bump and a scrape. You're like, well, that's going to happen, man. It's like next time, don't like run into a tree when you're like playing football with your friends or whatever. Like I can't stop and take every tree out of the road. But eventually you gotta have the lesson of like, hey, look, I'm known for being the super casual guy. I'm known for being the very welcoming and very kind and like super softball guy. The thing about Rule Zero and everything is that I want to make sure that everybody's having fun, but not at the expense of forcing other people to sacrifice their own enjoyment for yours. If you're having a bad time, I believe that, like I said at the beginning, there's two axioms I've got. One is that you're responsible for the fun of the rest of the table, and two is you're responsible for your own fun, right?
Hmm.
And like that also means don't be the one who's dragging everybody else down. Like let the person enjoy their win. Yeah, it sucks for you, and sometimes you just got to sit, deep breath, take it, and move on and figure out how to build better from there. On the other half of you're responsible for the fun of your table, that's more of a deck construction thing. You are the one who's putting cards in your deck. You're the one who's making the choices to run Winter Orb or run Armageddon or run whatever it
Hmm.
is. You're the one making the choices to play these cards to when are you deploying these things? What does the rest of the board state look like? And you're also the one who's responsible for looking at the other players, reading them and saying, hey, this person is not here to win the game. They're just trying to get this one combo to go off. I have the disruption for this combo. They're not going to win the game anyway, so let me just let them have it. Right? Like that's not sandbagging necessarily, but that's also going to maximize their enjoyment. Like how many times have you been in a game where it's like, look, I didn't win, but all of our decks popped off and it was awesome. Right?
Oh,
Like that is
that's
such a
the best. That's
that is the best.
the most desirable situation to be in. I don't think
And
I've ever cared less about winning the game where everybody popped off.
that's exactly it to me. That's exactly it. It's like if you have it in you to stop someone from popping off and you know that they're not going to win anyways, don't. Let them pop, let them have their fun, and then just go on. Again, it's all about the mentality you bring to the game. What are you here for? What is the goal? Are we here to win? Are we here to enjoy ourselves? And that comes all the way back to that rule zero discussion where you sit there in the beginning and you say, hey, what do I want out of this experience? And are we on the same page? Is the experience that we both want to have going to be, or is the experience, is it compatible? Or is the experience that I want to have and the experience you want to have just not going to work together? That's the conversation we have to have.
Simple as, simple as. I think that's a great place to stop. Want to one more time shout out your socials and where we can find you, and maybe even a hot take just for me to
I just
clip and
gave you
put
like
on.
an hour and change of hot takes, man.
That's the thing about this conversation is I feel like none of it should be a hot take, but people always want to disagree with you, and I think that's thank you for being the face of that, so people can yell at you and not me, I guess, because I
Like I don't
definitely
mind.
feel it.
I know that I say things. Remember, there's this notion of the overton window, right? Like if I want to drag people to casual, or not even to casual, but to just more relaxed social play, then I need to stake an extremist claim and get you guys midway there. That's just how you communicate, right? Like, and honestly, I enjoy it. I like this a lot. I like talking to people and I like seeing what they want to do out of the game. And I really enjoy when people are like, oh man, me and my buddies are doing this super heinous thing and I bet you're going to hate it. And I'm like, are you kidding me? If the four of you are having a good time, then I am having the best time in the world. If you guys are
Absolutely.
breaking every rule, if you're making decks specifically to spite me and you're having a blast, I won. That is all I want in life is for you to have a good time. So
Oh,
whatever it
exactly.
takes for you to have a good time, I don't care. Like, I will happily be your punching bag because I am a big boy and can handle it. And if you guys are enjoying yourself, then I've done my job.
Absolutely. I often tell people games I've lost where I've mostly decked out. I got to see every card in my deck. That's a win for me. I don't care how the rest of the game goes. That's and the post game conversations are absolutely my favorite about that because I love hearing people say, "I got to do this unique interaction, and that made me so happy."
Exactly.
That is exactly the kind of thing I want to cultivate in Magic. That's if I could spend the rest of my life just trying to figure out how to make that more consistent for people, that would be my life because that is just so precious to me that people find this very unique thing that makes them happy in a game that I
Yes.
love, so I get to see it.
100%.
All right, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's such a good conversation. Like I said, I've never had a bad conversation. Bringing people on to talk about these things 'cause
You're still new. You will have them.
I'm sure this probably won't be the last time we talk. Maybe I'll chime in a little bit more when I see you online. I definitely need to get on your other podcast because I think I'm only sub to one of them. So definitely need to do that.
So
Oh,
yeah, again, I guess you can find me at Gear Report Gears on Twitter, or really anywhere. It's not hard to find me. And you can also find me at Casual Magic or Achievement Wheel of Love Magic or the Chronicles of Dragonlance. And yeah, if you guys have
perfect.
any questions or want to yell at me, feel free. I'm here. Happy to take it.
Yep, for sure. You can go to his socials or you can leave it in the comments and I will relay it to Shivam for sure. I'll definitely say the mean things you leave for him. And make sure that you subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube and follow the podcast if you're on Spotify or anywhere else that this podcast ends up because it's everywhere apparently.
Thanks for having me.